1. Disfluencies. Generous and consistent. 1. Disfluencies, generous and consistent. Use filler words like, well, so and right constantly. These shouldn't just be at the beginnings of sentences. They belong in the middle of thoughts as speakers search for the right word. I mean, it's completely counterintuitive to how we're, usually taught this stuff.
Right. Because we get this narrative of, immediate European dominance. 2. Short turns and active listening. 2. Short turns and active listening. Speakers should rarely monologue, break long explanations with brief interjections, affirmations, or clarifying questions from the other speaker.
Yeah.
So they had to rely on complex diplomacy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and intense economic trade. It was a completely different psychological strategy.
Okay, so it wasn't just brute force. 3. Cutoffs, false starts, and interruptions. 3. Cutoffs, false starts, and interruptions. Real speakers often start a sentence, change their mind, and restart. They also talk over each other. Use dashes, or to indicate this. Never use ellipses. But if you think about, put yourself in their shoes for a second.
Exactly, because if you reject the priest...
You reject the guns.
Right, and you leave your people completely defenseless. 4. Colloquialisms and casual phrasing. 4. Colloquialisms and casual phrasing. Use everyday idioms and conversational connectors. Phrases like, unpack this, fast forward, boils down to, or let that sink in, help maintain an approachable but serious documentary tone. So let's unpack that a bit, because the logistics there are just wild.
It really is. It basically boils down to this massive high-stakes bet. 5. Erect address. 5. Direct address. Keep the listener involved as a silent third participant.
I want you, listening to this, to just imagine that reality for a second. Natural notes. I want you to imagine walking into a massive, bustling room where you fully intend to dictate all the rules.
Right.
Like you've traveled a vast distance with this absolute, unwavering conviction that you need to change how everyone in this room thinks, how they dress, how they organize their families, and, how they pray.
A total overhaul of their reality. Exactly. But the moment you actually walk through the door, you realize there is a massive catch.
A terrifying one, if you're them.
Yeah, because you are outnumbered 50-1. And the people in this room are heavily armed. They're brilliantly, intricately organized in their politics. And, crucially, they are standing firmly on their own home turf.
Which completely shatters that illusion of control.
It does. You can't just shout orders. You definitely can't use force. You have to make a very careful, very high-stakes bet on how to convince them. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. I'm so glad you're joining us today because the scenario I just described, it isn't some hypothetical thought experiment.
No, not at all. It's the daily, visceral reality of the 17th century Eastern Woodlands of North America.
Right.
If you are a European stepping off a boat into that specific world, that illusion of dominance has to be abandoned the literal moment your boots hit the dirt.
And that is just so completely counterintuitive to how we usually picture European colonial history, right?
Absolutely.
We are so often taught this sweeping, inevitable narrative of European dominance from day one. But that was categorically not the reality here.
No. The French and the English, who arrived in what is now upstate New York, New England, the Great Lakes region.
They were vastly, almost comically outnumbered.
Yes, by incredibly powerful indigenous confederacies.
We're talking about nations like the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and this massive network of Algonquian-speaking peoples.
And they controlled everything. They controlled the trade routes, the military alliances. They held the actual, undeniable balance of power in the region.
And that power dynamic changes everything about how these two distinct cultures interact.
Because of that reality, the European missionaries who arrived with this explicit goal of converting these populations, they couldn't rely on the brutal top-down systems we've seen elsewhere.
Like the encomienda system down in Spanish-controlled territory.
Exactly. There was no captive labor pool to draw from here. They had no standing armies to enforce their will.
So what do you do?
Instead, they had to rely on complex diplomacy, deep economic trade, and frankly, intense psychological strategy.
Which is exactly what our mission is for today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to examine the source material surrounding two wildly different, diametrically opposed strategies used by these missionaries.
They were trying to convert a population that essentially held all the cards.
Right, and the ways they went about it just couldn't have been more different.
It really boils down to two fundamental bets placed by the Europeans.
Okay, let's lay those out.
So on one side of the map, you have the French Jesuits.
Yeah.
The native populations often referred to them as the Black Robes because of their traditional cassocks.
And they operated primarily in New France, right? So stretching from Quebec down into the Great Lakes.
Correct. And their strategic bet was accommodation.
Accommodation, okay.
They believed they had to infiltrate, embed themselves entirely, and adapt to indigenous life just to gain any traction at all.
And then on the other side, further south in the region we now call New England, you have the English Puritans. And they looked at that French strategy and decided to take the exact opposite approach. Their bet was assimilation.
Total assimilation.
For the Puritans, spiritual conversion was completely meaningless unless the native people entirely surrendered their culture, their seasonal movements, their legal structures, basically everything that made them who they were.
Yet, despite these philosophies being, total opposites on both a theological and practical level, the historical record shows us they share a very dark commonality.
Yeah. Both of these strategies ended in absolute catastrophe for the indigenous peoples they targeted.
Horrific waves of disease, brutal warfare, forced internment.
And this is what makes this specific pocket of history so incredibly profound to study, and why I wanted us to dive into this today. An instrument that was quite literally designed to erase an entire culture would, centuries later, become the exact tool used to bring its language back from the dead.
It is truly one of the most remarkable historical reversals you will ever encounter.
It gives me chills. But to really understand the mechanics of how we get to that ultimate reversal, we have to build the foundation first.
Right. We need to start in New France with those black robes and look closely at what actually happens when your only option is to convert by infiltration.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the Jesuit approach is fascinating on just a purely logistical level.
It's extreme.
They didn't arrive, build these massive European stone fortresses, and demand that the native leadership come to them.
No, they packed up and went out into the indigenous villages alone.
They slept in the communal longhouses, which were these massive bark-covered structures housing multiple families.
And filled with smoke, dogs, a completely alien rhythm of life.
They ate the local food, which was often vastly different from the French diet. And crucially, they spent years, decades even learning these deeply complex local languages.
Languages with totally different grammatical structures from anything in Europe.
Just so they could argue the nuances of Catholic theology, they even adapted their rituals to fit native metaphors. I mean, it's almost like a modern deep-cover diplomatic mission.
That's a very strong analogy.
You have to embed yourself completely and learn the cultural idioms just to get a seat at the table.
You do. But I would caution against viewing this through a lens of modern, progressive open-mindedness.
Oh, sure.
It's really tempting to look back and think, oh, the Jesuits were these 17th century pioneer anthropologists who just loved and respected cultural diversity.
Right, like it was an early cultural exchange program or something.
Exactly, and it wasn't. It was a strict tactical necessity born of extreme weakness.
Right.
Like we established, they lacked the numbers, and they had absolutely no military dominance. If a Jesuit priest walked into a Huron-Wendat village of 2,000 people and started violently smashing their sacred items,
or demanding they drop everything to build him a European-style manor,
he wouldn't last the week. He would be expelled or simply killed.
Yeah.
Accommodation was the only viable strategy for survival, let alone influence.
So it's pure pragmatism.
The Jesuits were highly educated men. They were trained in rhetoric and debate. They realized immediately that to even begin a conversation about the Trinity or salvation, they had to map those concepts onto existing indigenous spirituality.
They had to find the parallels.
They did.
So they're out there translating prayers into native metaphors instead of demanding European dress codes. But behind this supposed soft power, behind the linguistic respect, and the shared meals around the fire in the longhouse, there is some very hard, undeniable leverage at play.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources show us this wasn't just a battle of ideas.
That's the layer that makes this history so complex. Spiritual conversion in the Eastern Woodlands was inextricably linked to global economics and military survival.
Yeah.
The Jesuits didn't just walk into the woods with Bibles and good arguments. They brought with them the keys to the French imperial supply chain.
The fur trade.
Yes.
Specifically the beaver pelt, which was, driving the European fashion market at the time, and the musket, which was entirely reshaping the balance of power in North America.
Precisely. French colonial policy was incredibly strategic here. It dictated that Christian converts received significantly better prices for their pelts when they traded with the French.
Wow. So that alone creates an economic class divide within a native village.
It does. But the true game changer, the ultimate leverage, was firearms.
Right.
If you were a native person who agreed to be baptized, you earned the exclusive right to buy French muskets.
And if you didn't?
Non-Christians, the traditionalists holding on to their ancestral ways, were strictly denied that access.
And this is where I have to push back on the historical record, treating these conversions as purely spiritual, theological awakening.
Oh, you have to read against the grain of the sources here.
I mean, put yourself in this environment. You are living in a region that is being completely violently remade by gun warfare. The wooden armor your ancestors wore into battle, it is suddenly completely useless against a lead ball.
It offers zero protection.
Your neighboring nations are getting armed, your historical enemies are getting armed, and the only way you can get a musket to defend your family, to ensure your village isn't literally wiped off the map, is to agree to get baptized by the strange guy in the black robe living in your longhouse.
It's a brutal choice.
Is that a genuine spiritual conversion, or is that just a really grim, pragmatic defense strategy?
I think we have to accept that it was both. And the ratio of faith to pragmatism varied wildly from person to person.
Sure.
For some, the spiritual connection to the Catholic rituals might have been profound and genuine. But you absolutely cannot separate the theology from the musket in this era.
You just can't.
By tying the primary tool of physical survival to a religious ritual, the French missionaries drove a wedge straight into the heart of indigenous societies. Conversion literally became a matter of national security for these native confederacies.
I want you, listening to this, to just put yourself in the shoes of a Huron-Wendat political leader for a second. Let's really think about the weight of this.
It's an impossible situation.
You are helping guide a confederacy of roughly 30,000 people. You have a complex, settled agricultural society. And suddenly, you are forced to balance the ancient spiritual traditions that have held your people together for centuries with the literal physical survival of your villages.
In a changing, heavily armed world.
Exactly. If you reject the priest, you reject the guns, and you leave your people defenseless against your enemies. But if you accept the priest, you fracture your society from the inside out.
You create two classes of citizens, the traditionalists and the armed new converts.
And that internal fracturing wasn't theoretical, was it?
No, it is exactly what happened. We see in the historical records that long-standing villages literally split into hostile factions.
Wow.
The social cohesion, the shared rituals and understandings that had sustained the Huron-Wendat for generations began to violently pull apart under the immense, crushing pressure of this new reality. Families were divided. Leadership councils were deadlocked.
It's a pressure cooker. And this intense pressure to convert for survival didn't just change individual minds. It fractured entire societies from within, leading us directly into the first great catastrophe of our deep dive.
Right.
Because the missionaries didn't just bring muskets, theology, and economic disruption. They brought something much, much worse. Something they didn't even fully understand themselves.
To grasp the sheer scale of the devastation that followed, we have to look really closely at the primary sources from this era. And the most crucial documents we have are the Jesuit Relations.
Right, the Jesuit Relations, which were written roughly between 1632 and 1673.
Correct.
Basically, these were dense annual reports sent by the missionaries out in the field back to their superiors in Paris.
And they weren't just filed away in a drawer somewhere. They were printed relatively cheaply and distributed widely across France.
They are fascinating documents because they served a very specific dual purpose.
They did. On one hand, they are incredibly detailed eyewitness ethnographies.
The priests recorded minute details of indigenous languages, child-rearing practices, governance structures, warfare tactics. I mean, anthropologists today still rely heavily on them.
They do. But we have to remember their second purpose. They were highly crafted propaganda.
It was essentially a 17th century crowdfunding campaign mixed with a dramatic colonial dispatch.
Exactly. The Jesuits needed to raise massive amounts of money from wealthy French aristocrats and patrons to fund their operations.
And they also needed to recruit zealous young priests and lay workers, right? Including groups of nuns like the Ursulines.
The Ursulines are a great example to bring up here. They were an order of nuns who read these relations in France, felt a profound religious calling, and traveled across the ocean to Quebec to establish schools and hospitals.
All funded entirely by the donations these texts generated back home.
Exactly. So to keep that money and those volunteers flowing across the Atlantic, the Relations framed the North American wilderness as this epic, literal battleground between God and the devil.
They cast the indigenous traditional spiritual leaders, the shamans, as direct agents of Satan.
It was gripping reading for a devout French public.
But while the Jesuits were consciously writing this dramatic propaganda to secure their funding, they accidentally recorded something else entirely.
Yes, they provided an unintentional, day-by-day record of a biological apocalypse.
The epidemics. Smallpox, influenza, measles. The records show that starting around 1634, wherever the black robes went, these horrific diseases inevitably followed.
We have to step back and look at the underlying epidemiological mechanics here.
Yeah.
It's the concept of a virgin soil epidemic.
Right.
The Jesuits, having grown up in dense, crowded, highly unsanitary European cities, possessed childhood immunity to these diseases. They carried the pathogens, but their bodies knew how to fight them.
But the indigenous populations of the Eastern Woodlands had been separated from those disease pools for millennia. They had absolutely zero acquired immunity.
None. So the timeline plays out the same terrifying way over and over. A Jesuit priest would walk into a Wendat village. He would be welcomed into a longhouse.
And then,
A few days or weeks later, a mysterious outbreak would hit. People are suddenly dying in horrific numbers, suffering from fevers and sores. They have no traditional medicine to treat.
and the Jesuits, for the most part, survived the outbreak.
Yes, the native people die. And crucially, and this is the detail that seals it, the Jesuits, believing they were doing God's work, were incredibly eager to baptize the dying.
Especially the sick infants and children.
Yes, to save their souls before they pass away.
What's fascinating here is how the indigenous traditionalists observed and interpreted this exact sequence of events.
This is so important.
The Jesuit Relations constantly complain about native resistance, framing it as superstitious stubbornness or the literal whisperings of the devil. But if you read between the lines of the Jesuits' own accounts, you don't see superstition at all.
Not at all.
You see brilliant, raw, observable data analysis by the native people.
It wasn't magic to them. It was
Yep.
perfectly logical deduction based on the scientific method of observation.
Yes. Look at the data points the native leaders had. Point A, a foreign priest arrives in our village.
Right.
Point B, a mysterious, invisible, devastating disease breaks out. Point C, the priest performs a strange water ritual on a sick child, chanting in a foreign language. Point D, the child dies almost immediately after the ritual.
And point E, the priest remains completely healthy.
Exactly. So what is the only logical conclusion you can draw from that data?
The logical conclusion is that the priest is a herald of death, and the ritual of baptism is a lethal curse designed to kill children.
It is airtight logic based on the evidence available to them at the time. Why on earth wouldn't you think baptism was a death sentence when every single time you saw it happen, someone died?
You'd have to be foolish not to make that connection.
This is exactly why it is so vital to read historical sources critically. The Jesuit Relations are written exclusively by the converters. They own the pen, they own the narrative.
But by looking closely at what they accidentally reveal their frustration, that the natives think they are sorcerers, we see the deep-grounded rationality of the indigenous resistance.
It really forces us to confront the inherent bias in how history is recorded. We are reading the Missionaries' version of events, where they are the heroes trying to save souls.
But the native interpretation that the water ritual equals death was a highly accurate, empirically sound reading of the reality unfolding right in front of them. The priests were literally bringing death, even if they didn't understand the microbiology of how.
And this combination is just catastrophic. You have the diseases wiping out a massive percentage of the population.
Upwards of 50 to 60% in some areas.
You have the intense internal religious division tearing families apart over whether to accept the missionaries, and you have the external military pressure of the musket trade forcing their hand.
It created a perfect storm of vulnerability.
And that storm broke right over the Huron-Wendat Confederacy.
It did. The fall of Huronia is one of the most tragic and complex geopolitical events of this entire period.
We're talking about a settled, powerful agricultural confederacy of roughly 30,000 people.
They controlled vast trade networks. And because of their prominence, they were the Jesuits' primary, most prized mission field.
But by the late 1640s, they are severely weakened. The epidemics have ravaged their numbers, and socially, they are deeply divided from within.
You have some people living in the villages who are Jesuit-aligned converts, armed with French muskets. You have others who are traditionalists, holding on to their ancestral ways, resenting the converts.
The social fabric is tearing apart at the seams.
And sensing this profound vulnerability, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, specifically the Mohawk and Seneca nations, launch a campaign of total war.
And we really need to explain the mechanics of this war because the Iroquois have a distinct, massive advantage here.
Yes,
A huge one. They aren't dealing with the French. They are allied with the Dutch further south at Fort Orange, which is modern-day Albany.
This is a crucial layer. The geopolitical proxy war between European powers was playing out through indigenous alliances. The Dutch at Fort Orange were much more liberal with their gun trade than the French were. They didn't require a religious conversion to buy a weapon.
They just wanted the beaver pelts to send back to the Dutch West India Company.
Exactly. So the Haudenosaunee were heavily armed with Dutch flintlock muskets. Furthermore, they were engaged in what historians call morning wars.
Morning wars. Explain that.
These were campaigns specifically designed to capture enemy populations to replace their own devastating population losses from the epidemics.
Oh, wow.
So you have a highly motivated, heavily armed Confederacy attacking a fractured, weakened one.
The violence described in the sources is just absolute and overwhelming. The Haudenosaunee bypassed traditional skirmishes and began burning entire Wendat villages to the ground.
Total war.
By around 1650, the Huron-Wendat Confederacy, as an organized political and geographic entity, collapses entirely.
The survivors are forced to disperse, fleeing their ancestral homelands, seeking refuge with other allied nations, or merging into the communities of their attackers.
And in the midst of this total destruction, several of the Jesuit missionaries who had embedded themselves in the villages are captured.
Yes. The most famous of these are Jean de Brebeuf and Gabriel Lalemant.
Right.
They were captured by the Haudenosaunee in 1649 during a massive attack on a Wendat town. The Jesuits were subjected to extreme, ritualized torture and execution.
The descriptions and the relations of what happened to them are just brutal. They were essentially mocked for their faith.
They were baptized with boiling water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And centuries later, the Catholic Church eventually canonized Brebeuf, Lalemant, and several others as the North American martyrs in 1930.
Their martyrdom became a massive rallying cry for the Catholic Church. But stepping back into the historical analysis, this raises a fiercely contested question among historians.
Which is?
Did the Jesuits, through their accommodation strategy, actually cause the fall of Huronia?
Right, like how much of the blame for the destruction of a 30,000-person society falls on the guys in the black robes who insisted on living in their longhouses?
It is a delicate balance. You cannot reduce the total collapse of a massive confederacy to just the presence of a few dozen French priests.
No, that seems historically inaccurate.
It is. The virgin soil epidemics were a massive, arguably the primary destabilizing factor. The global capitalist demand for beaver pelts and the resulting gun trade was another.
And the strategic brilliance, adaptability, and military might of the Iroquois Confederacy was yet another massive factor.
Exactly. So the way to look at it is that the Jesuits were a potent accelerant, not the sole underlying cause.
They introduced the bitter internal divisions, and they controlled the conditional access to weapons that made the Wendat society incredibly fragile at the exact worst moment in their history.
Right, but they didn't invent the microbes, and they didn't pull the triggers for the Dutch-armed Iroquois.
That's the most historically sound reading. They were one deeply disruptive ideological element in a profoundly complex geopolitical collapse. Their bet on accommodation ended in ashes.
It really did.
Okay, so that is the French strategy. You embed yourself, you cause internal fracturing, and it ends in a shattered confederacy, dispersed peoples, and dead, martyred missionaries.
Total disaster.
Now, if you are the English colonial leadership further south in New England, and you are watching all this chaos unfold up north, you might look at that and think, well, let's try something completely different.
And they did. They decided to take the exact opposite approach to the native populations.
The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies made a completely different theological and practical bet.
They had absolutely no desire to infiltrate the indigenous world. They wanted to eradicate it entirely.
The Puritan mindset is just so wildly different from the Jesuits. It's fascinating to compare them side by side.
Night and day.
The Jesuits were willing to sleep in a smoky longhouse, eat unfamiliar food, and learn difficult languages just to win a single soul. The Puritans, they were terrified of the wilderness.
Their theology taught them that the untamed woods and the people living in them were inherently evil and would corrupt their own godly, pristine city upon a hill.
They weren't looking for clever theological parallels between their faith and native traditions.
No, they didn't want to translate the Trinity into an Algonquian metaphor. They looked at native society and saw a blank slate that needed to be aggressively, totally scrubbed clean.
Their strategy was to force the converts to come out of their indigenous world entirely and step into a replica of an English one.
Enter a man named John Eliot.
Right.
He was a highly educated Puritan minister who eventually became known as the Apostle to the Indians. Starting around 1651, Eliot began securing land grants to found what were called praying towns.
Praying towns. The first one was a settlement named Natick, right?
Yes. And eventually, this system grew to include 14 of these towns scattered across Massachusetts.
And life inside these praying towns was strictly, oppressively regulated. It was not just a place to go to church on Sundays.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Or really disturbing, depending on how you look at the mechanics of colonialism.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about changing your theology. It was assimilation as architecture. It was social engineering down to the studs.
If you were a native person who, perhaps due to the devastation of the epidemics or loss of land, decided to move to a praying town, you had to physically alter every single aspect of your daily existence.
It was a total sensory and structural overhaul. You had to cut your hair to the short English style, abandoning the traditional ways men wore their hair.
You had to abandon your traditional leather clothing and wear woven English clothes.
You had to stop your traditional seasonal movements. Native peoples would typically move from the coast in the summer for fishing to the inland forests in the winter for hunting.
Right.
But now, you had to farm in the static, permanently enclosed English way.
You had to move out of your communal, multifamily structures and live in English-style, single-family frame houses. I mean, think about what that alone does to the social fabric. Breaking up the extended kinship networks into isolated nuclear families.
It shatters the community structure.
And worst of all, you had to submit to a strict Puritan legal code that explicitly criminalized your own culture.
Traditional native governance was outlawed. Healing ceremonies were outlawed. Even the traditional storytelling of your people, the myths and histories passed down orally, were made illegal to share.
If we lay the two methods side by side, it's striking. The Jesuits used cultural accommodation as a tool to achieve religious conversion. The Puritans used religious conversion as a justification for total cultural replacement.
That's a perfect summary.
Just imagine that reality for a second. Think about the stories your parents or your grandparents told you to put you to sleep when you were a kid. The stories that explain how the world works, where the stars came from.
Your entire worldview.
Right. Imagine you decide to embrace a new faith because your world is changing, and suddenly the colonial law tells you that repeating those bedtime stories to your own children is a literal criminal act, punishable by the magistrate.
It's a systematic attempt to erase the soul of a people.
And to enforce this new, rigid, English-speaking reality, John Eliot knew he needed the ultimate tool of Protestant conversion.
Right, because the Protestant faith, unlike the Catholic missions of the time, hinged on the individual's ability to read the scripture.
He couldn't just preach to them in English. The converts needed to be able to read the Word of God themselves in their own language to truly internalize it. He needed to produce a Bible.
And this necessity brings us to one of the most incredible, complex artifacts in American history, the 1663 Massachusett Bible.
The title in the language is the Mamus Wana Tupanatamwe, a Biblum God.
Yes.
I want to stress the magnitude of this. This is the very first Bible ever printed anywhere in the Western Hemisphere.
It wasn't printed in English. It wasn't printed in Spanish.
The first Bible printed in the Americas was printed in the indigenous Massachusetts language.
It is a monumental historical achievement. But here is the critical historical nuance that often gets lost in the colonial narrative.
Let's hear it.
John Eliot gets his name on the title page. He is remembered in the history books as the great solitary translator, this genius working alone by candlelight. But Eliot could never, ever have done this alone.
Not a chance. Think about the mechanics of what he was trying to do. Translating abstract, highly specific 17th century Protestant theological concepts, ideas about original sin, redemption, the Lamb of God into an Algonquian language.
With entirely different grammatical structures, vocabularies, and cultural touchstones.
It's a monumental intellectual task. How do you translate Lamb of God when there are literally no sheep in the Americas?
Which is exactly why we have to center the native collaborators who actually made this physical book happen. The historical records give us the names of men like Kakano, Jode Nesitan, and crucially, James Printer.
James Printer is such a fascinating figure. His actual native name was Wows. He was a Nipmuc man who attended the Indian College at Harvard.
Yes.
But he was literally given the English surname Printer by the colonists because he was the one physically setting the type for this massive book.
Do you know how hard it is to set type for a 1,200-page book in a language that has never been written down before?
Oh, man.
Dealing with phonetic spellings created by an Englishman.
It requires immense technical skill and deep linguistic understanding. Without the intellect of these native men, their fluency in both worlds, and their grueling physical labor at the printing press, John Eliot's famous Bible simply would not exist.
It wouldn't. And the irony here is just staggering. It's almost too perfect.
Right. You have the Puritans building these praying towns with the explicit goal of completely erasing indigenous culture. They view native traditions as savage, ungodly, and inferior.
Yet, to create their most sacred foundational text, the very engine they hope will drive this assimilation, they find themselves completely dependent on the deep intellectual engagement, linguistic genius, and the physical skill of the very native people they're trying to erase.
They literally need indigenous minds to build the machinery of indigenous erasure.
It beautifully highlights the inescapable interdependence of the colonial frontier. Even when one side is actively designing a system to dominate and replace the other, they are forced to rely on them.
But we have to recognize that this Puritan system of assimilation, this deeply held illusion that native people could be safely and peacefully absorbed into English society, if they just changed their clothes, cut their hair, and read the right Bible, was incredibly fragile.
And that fragility shattered completely in 1675.
With the outbreak of King Philip's War.
Yes, Metacom, a powerful Wôpanâak leader, whom the English referred to as King Philip, goes to war against the colonists.
And the context here is vital. This wasn't unprovoked. The tensions over relentless English land theft, broken treaties, colonial livestock destroying native crops, and aggressive colonial expansion finally reach a breaking point.
It becomes one of the deadliest conflicts per capita in all of American history. It devastated both the colonial and native populations of New England.
And for the native people living inside those 14 praying towns, this war exposed the ultimate tragic lie of the Puritan promise of assimilation.
Because from their perspective, they had done everything right.
Yeah, they followed the rules, they cut their hair, they abandoned their ancestral homes and moved into the frame houses, they farmed the English way, they learned to read the Massachusett Bible, they prayed to the Puritan God.
They surrendered their entire cultural identity in exchange for the promise of a safe place in this new society.
But the moment the war broke out, the English colonists looked at the praying Indians and they didn't see fellow Protestant Christians.
No, they saw spies. They saw an internal racial threat.
The deep-seated racial and cultural paranoia of the colonists completely overrode any shared religious identity they claimed to value.
They were entirely betrayed by the people who had demanded their assimilation in the first place.
Which leads us directly to the second massive catastrophe of our deep dive, the atrocity of Deer Island.
In the winter of 1675, as King Philip's War is raging across the countryside and paranoia is at its absolute peak, the Massachusetts authorities make a devastating, calculated decision.
Okay.
They order the rounding up of approximately 500 praying Indians, largely from the Nipmuc and other allied nations.
Let me reiterate that. These are men, women, and children who had explicitly allied themselves with the English. They were the converts.
They tear them from their homes in the praying towns, march them to the coast, and forcibly intern them on Deer Island, a small landmass located out in Boston Harbor.
And if you've ever been to Boston in the dead of winter, you know the wind coming off that harbor is utterly brutal. Now imagine being placed on a barren island in the middle of that harbor.
With none.
The colonial authorities provided no adequate food rations, no proper shelter to withstand the freezing rain and snow, and no winter clothing. They basically dump 500 of their own religious converts on a freezing rock and abandon them to the elements.
The mortality rate was horrific, as you would expect. The records indicate that more than half of the people interned on Deer Island that winter died of starvation, exposure to the freezing temperatures, and rampant disease.
And for the survivors, the nightmare didn't end when the winter finally broke and the war concluded. Many of those who managed to live through the horrors of Deer Island were subsequently sold into slavery.
Shipped off to the sugar plantations in the West Indies.
The praying towns, the grand Puritan experiment in assimilation, never recovered. Their lands were conveniently seized by the English colonists.
If we pull back and connect this to our initial premise, the two bets placed by the Europeans, the conclusion is stark and unavoidable. You have the French Jesuit philosophy of deep cultural infiltration and accommodation, and you have the English Puritan philosophy of total cultural erasure and assimilation. They are exact opposites in their theological and practical approach.
Yet both methods, driven by the underlying machinery of colonialism, culminated in mass death, displacement, and the shattering of the indigenous populations they targeted. It really makes you question the fundamental nature of the entire colonial project. Neither method offered genuine safety. Accommodation brought diseases and proxy wars. Assimilation brought betrayal and internment.
It's devastating.
If you stop the story here, it's just a massive, sweeping narrative of betrayal, war, and collapse. It's incredibly bleak. It makes you wonder if anyone navigated this era without just being crushed by the macro-level machinery of it.
The macro-level machinery was crushing, absolutely. But history is made up of individuals. If you zoom in on the micro level, if you look at individual lives, you find these incredible, enduring stories of native survival and defiance.
You see people refusing to be passive victims of European strategies.
Exactly. They are active agents, interpreting, choosing, and navigating unimaginable chaos.
Which is exactly why I wanted to bring Kateri Tekakwitha into this deep dive. Her story is so vitally important because it complicates everything we've just talked about. She breaks the mold.
She really does. Kateri was a Mohawk Algonquin woman born in a village called Ossarnanon, located in what is now upstate New York, right in the heart of Haudenosaunee territory.
And she lived through the exact biological apocalypse we discussed earlier with the Jesuit Relations.
She was a smallpox survivor. The disease swept through her village when she was very young. It killed her parents and her baby brother, leaving her an orphan.
It also left her face severely scarred and her vision permanently impaired. So she knew firsthand, in the most visceral way possible, the devastation that arrived with the Europeans and their microbes.
And yet, despite that profound personal trauma, and despite the intense political pressure within her own Mohawk community, who understandably viewed the French and their religion with deep suspicion, Kateri eventually chose to embrace Catholicism.
But we have to be precise here. She didn't do it because she was physically coerced. And she didn't do it as a pragmatic, desperate play to get French muskets for her family.
No, she embraced it strictly on her own terms. The way she practiced her faith was entirely unique. She engaged in severe bodily mortification, she committed herself to deep, isolated prayer, and she took a vow of perpetual virginity.
These were practices that actually alarmed both some of the Jesuit missionaries who felt she was taking things too far without their permission, and her own traditional Mohawk relative, who expected her to marry and contribute to the clan's lineage.
What is so fascinating about Kateri is how she redefined conversion. She didn't passively submit to the missionaries' vision of what a docile Catholic convert should be. She essentially bypassed their authority.
She used the conceptual tools of their faith, the asceticism, the devotion to the suffering of Christ, to forge her own direct, intense spiritual path. I think of it like this. It's like a person finding their own unique, incredibly powerful voice, but doing it using the vocabulary of a completely foreign language.
Yes.
The Jesuits brought the Catholic vocabulary, but Kateri wrote her own poetry with it. She utilized the faith to assert her own individual agency, her own bodily autonomy in a world that was literally falling apart around her.
And her legacy is a lasting testament to that specific agency.
Hmm.
In 2012, Pope Benedict XVI officially canonized Kateri Tekakwitha, making her the first Native American Catholic saint.
She had previously been beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1980.
And there's such a profound historical resonance there when you think about it. The Catholic Church today honors both the French missionary martyr, Jean de Brébeuf, who was killed by the Haudenosaunee while trying to convert them,
and the native convert, Kateri, a woman of Haudenosaunee descent, who embraced the faith her own way despite the missionaries. It perfectly frames how complex, tangled, and fiercely contested the history of these missions truly is.
Kateri represents the survival and agency of the individual spirit in the face of colonial collapse. But as we move toward the final chapter of our deep dives, there's another story of survival we absolutely have to tell.
It's not just about an individual, it's about an entire culture.
And it might be the most incredible historical reversal, the most astonishing act of reclamation I've ever come across in my research.
It is the ultimate testament to resilience. To tell it, we have to fast forward a long way. We have to step out of the 17th century, past the destruction of the Praying Towns, past the horrors of Deer Island, and move all the way to the year 1993.
In 1993, we meet a woman named Jessie Little Doe Baird. She is a citizen of the Mashpee Wôpanâak tribe.
And the Wôpanâak, remember, are the people of Metacom, King Philip. They are the people who inhabited the coast of Massachusetts when the Pilgrims arrived.
They are the very people whose lands and culture were explicitly targeted by John Eliot and the Puritans.
By the late 20th century, the Wôpanâak language had not been spoken natively by anyone for over a century. Linguists officially categorize it as a dead language.
But Jessie Little Doe Baird experienced something profound. She began having a series of dreams, recurring visions, where her ancestors spoke to her. They were speaking in a language she couldn't cognitively understand, but which she deeply knew was her own ancestral tongue.
This deeply personal vision set her on a path that is almost hard to believe. She eventually applied to and earned a master's degree in linguistics at MIT.
Studying under some of the top linguists in the world.
She was absolutely determined to bring her language back to her people. But if you want to resurrect a language that hasn't been spoken in 100 years, you have a massive logistical problem.
You can't just interview an elder. You need an archive.
Right. You need a massive amount of written text to reconstruct the grammar rules, the specific vocabulary, the syntax, and what was the largest, most comprehensive surviving archive of the Massachusetts Wampanoag language in existence.
John Eliot's 1663 Bible, the Mamus Winnetupinatamwe up Biblum God.
I mean, let that sink in. How do you even begin to do that? How does a modern linguist use a 300-year-old Protestant Bible to reverse engineer a language?
It requires an incredible amount of linguistic detective work. Think about the challenge. Eliot was an Englishman. When he heard a Wampanoag word, he spelled it phonetically, using 17th century English spelling conventions.
Right, so it's filtered through his own ear.
So Baird had to essentially peer through Eliot's English biases. She had to compare the words in the 1663 Bible with related Algonquian languages that are still spoken today, like Ojibwe or Cree, to triangulate what the original Wampanoag word actually sounded like and how the complex verb structures worked.
She had to untangle the native grammar from the English theology.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean in the grand sweep of history? It means that Jessie Little Doe Baird launched the Wôpanâak Language Reclamation Project, and she did it by using the exact text that was explicitly designed to assimilate her ancestors into English culture.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of global linguistics and cultural survival, the magnitude of what she accomplished is staggering. Baird, who, by the way, later received a MacArthur Genius Fellowship for this incredible work, used the Puritan Bible, along with land deeds and other colonial texts, to meticulously resurrect Wampanoag.
It is officially recognized as the first language ever reclaimed with 0 living speakers.
The very tool of cultural erasure was physically transformed by a Wampanoag woman into the ultimate tool of cultural return.
The Puritan colonizers' printing press, operated by the native printer James Printer back in 1663, inadvertently created a time capsule for indigenous survival in the 21st century.
And the triumphant milestone of this reclamation project occurred in 2004. Jessie Little Doe Baird raised her daughter, May, hearing the reclaimed language from birth.
Yes.
In 2004, May became the first native speaker of the Wampanoag language in well over a century.
That gives me chills every single time I think about it. It is just an undeniable, magnificent victory of human resilience.
It genuinely forces us to reevaluate the entire history we've discussed today. The missionaries, whether they were relying on Jesuit accommodation in the longhouses or Puritan assimilation in the praying towns, sought to fundamentally alter or entirely erase indigenous reality.
They brought devastating disease, they fueled horrific wars, and they caused mass displacement.
But ultimately, in the longest arc of history, they failed to erase the people.
Let's quickly review the massive journey we've been on today. We started in a 17th century Eastern Woodland landscape where European missionaries arrived hopelessly outnumbered.
To survive and convert, they placed two opposite bets.
The French Jesuits chose accommodation, they infiltrated the longhouses, used the economic leverage of the musket trade, and inadvertently unleashed a biological apocalypse that native traditionalists logically, rightfully identified as a lethal curse.
And we saw how that specific accommodation strategy contributed to the internal fracturing and the ultimate tragic collapse of the 30,000-strong Huron-Wendat Confederacy during the Haudenosaunee Wars, leading to the deaths of missionaries like Brebeuf.
Then we shifted our focus to the English Puritans in New England who tried total cultural assimilation. They forced their converts into praying towns, mandated changes to their clothes, cut their hair, and outlawed their ancestral culture entirely.
They relied on native genius to print the 1663 Massachusett Bible.
Yet when the pressure of King Philip's War broke out, that promise of assimilation offered absolutely no physical protection.
The converts were betrayed by the colonists, and interned to die in the freezing, horrific conditions of Deer Island.
Both strategies, despite their completely opposite philosophies, yielded catastrophic results for the indigenous nations.
But the narrative doesn't end in catastrophe. It ends in profound agency.
We saw Kateri Tekakwitha redefining conversion on her own terms, bypassing colonial authority to become a saint.
And we witnessed the breathtaking reversal of Jessie Little Doe Baird, taking the Puritan tool of erasure and using it to breathe life back into the Wôpanâak language.
And it is so crucial to remember that this history is not just dusty facts locked in the 17th century. It is an ongoing lived reality today.
The Huron-Wendat survived their dispersal and persist forcefully today in communities like Wôpanâak in Quebec. The descendants of the praying Indians, including the Nipmuc, still gather at Deer Island every single year.
Yes, there was a beautiful memorial dedicated there in 2013 by the Mohawk artist Lloyd Gray. They gather to mourn the dead, yes, but also to loudly assert their unbroken resilience.
There is unfinished business here. History is still happening. It's the continuous, fragile work of language revival happening in classrooms and homes right now.
It's the ongoing legal and political fight for land and federal recognition by peoples whom colonial powers tried so hard to erase, but who are emphatically, undeniably still here.
It's a history that demands we look closely at how power operates, how archives are built, and how survival is fought for across generations.
And it leaves me with a thought I really want you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day.
We spend a lot of time in our modern era worrying about our data and who controls it.
Exactly. I want you to think about the digital footprints we leave behind every single day. The text messages, the emails, the search histories, the location data points we are constantly generating for massive institutions and tech companies.
Institutions that, quite frankly, might not have our best interests at heart.
They are building massive, unimaginably large archives of our lives for their own corporate or political purposes, much in the same way John Eliot built an archive of the Massachusett language to further his Puritan goals of assimilation.
What if a 17th century Bible, printed with the explicit, documented intent to erase a culture, could be picked up 300 years later by a Wôpanâak woman and used as the exact key to save it?
What hidden keys to the future might be locked away in the everyday data we are generating right now? What will the people of the future be able to reclaim, reconstruct, or resurrect from the records being forced upon us today?
It's a powerful reminder that while powerful institutions may create the archive and try to dictate the rules, they can never fully control how future generations will choose to read it or what they will do with it.
You truly never know what's going to switch sides in the long run. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. Remember, the next time you walk into a room where you think you know exactly how the rules work, you might just be setting the stage for a historical reversal you won't see coming for 300 years. Keep questioning the record, and we'll see you next time.